The story begins with a team of explorers who are in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. On the ship, there was a weather officer named David who was responsible for reporting the weather conditions. They were heading toward an island located in the middle of the ocean. The government had sent David there to observe and record the changing weather patterns on that island. David was supposed to stay there for about a year to collect weather data and then return after completing his assignment. He was provided with a year's worth of food and all necessary supplies. After several days of travel, they finally reached the island. Using a small boat, they landed on the island, which was completely deserted. Not even a single bird was visible. On that island, there was a lighthouse and a small house where David was supposed to stay. Previously, another weather officer named Robert had lived there. His one-year duty was over, so he had been waiting to return with the ship. Now, David would replace him and stay for the next year to continue weather observations. However, when the team entered the house, they were shocked to see that there was no sign of anyone there. All of Robert's belongings were scattered around the room. Then, the captain and David thought that maybe someone was in the lighthouse. Without wasting any time, they headed toward the lighthouse, and what they saw was strange. The entire lighthouse was surrounded by sharp wooden stakes, as if someone had deliberately blocked it to prevent anyone from going inside. They knocked several times, but there was no response. Finally, they forced the door open and went inside. Inside the lighthouse, they found a man named Gruner. When they asked him about the old weather officer Robert, Gruner replied that he was dead. He had gone toward the sea one day and never came back. Hearing this, both David and the captain were shocked. The captain then told David that if he wanted, he could still return with them, but David refused. David believed that if he could provide the government with accurate weather data from that island, he would earn a good amount of money. The captain then handed him a gun for self-protection and warned him that the place didn't seem safe. After that, they left, promising to return in a year. After the ship departed, David settled into the house and made it livable. Later that night, he found a diary in a drawer. It belonged to the old weather officer, Robert. The diary contained a lot of information about the island and mentioned some mysterious creatures, though the writing was incomplete and unclear. There were also strange sketches of unknown creatures. David couldn't understand why Robert had drawn them. Maybe he had done it out of loneliness. One page even had a photo of Robert's wife. Eventually, David got tired and fell asleep while reading. The next morning, David began collecting weather data. But when he reached near the sea, he noticed something strange. Some stones were arranged in a peculiar pattern, with seashells placed between them. He thought maybe Gruner had done it, so he ignored it and continued his work. While observing through his telescope, David saw another person standing with Gruner near the lighthouse, but in the blink of an eye, that figure disappeared. He tried to look again but saw nothing and assumed it was just his imagination. That night, while David was working, he heard a knock at the door. Thinking it might be Gruner, he called out his name, but there was no response. Holding a lamp, he moved toward the door, and then he heard strange, eerie sounds that definitely didn't belong to a human. Suddenly, he saw a terrifying sight. A grotesque hand was reaching under the door, trying to get inside. It was not a human hand at all. Shocked and terrified, David ran into the basement and hid there. Moments later, the mysterious creature broke into the house. It moved around, searching for David, while he watched in fear through a small crack in the basement wall. But then, the creature noticed his movement and saw David. He lunged at David to kill him and tried to grab him through the crack. To save himself, David immediately grabbed a knife and plunged it into the creature's eye. The creature screamed and ran away. But David knew it could return at any time, and now he was certain that the diary's entries about the creature were true. He could not sleep all night, terrified. The next morning, when David stepped outside, he saw tracks in the sand that were nothing like a human's. The tracks led straight into the sea. Now David understood why Gruner had set sharp wooden stakes around the lighthouse. He realized that if he stayed in the house, the creatures could kill him at any time. Terrified, David ran toward the lighthouse and shouted for Gruner to open the gate and let him in. But Gruner refused, saying David should have returned with the ship. Dejected, David turned away because Gruner didn't even want to look at him. Gruner splashed water on him and drove him off. David knew he had to take matters into his own hands. He boarded up every window of the house with wood, fenced the place with sharp stakes, and piled old papers and books outside the gate. He doused them with oil so that if the creatures returned, he could scare them off with fire. There was one thing David didn't know until that night. Fortunately, he found an old box inside the house containing a gun and many bullets. Seeing that gave him a little hope of staying alive. As the sun set, fear tightened in David's chest. Night fell quickly. He sat quietly in a corner of the house with a gun, his heart pounding. Then he heard a strange sound, and when he peered from a window toward the sea, the ground seemed to give way beneath him. Not one, but many of those bizarre creatures were crawling out of the water toward him. Soon they gathered and began trying to break down the gate. David opened fire immediately. Some of the creatures fell dead. He thought the shots would scare the others away, but seeing their companions die only made them angrier. Following his plan, David set the piled papers and old books on fire outside the gate. The creatures, frightened by the flames, retreated back into the sea. But the fire spread to David's house. The wooden door caught, and the blaze slowly spread through the house. David wrapped himself in a sheet to protect his life, ran outside, and hid behind a large rock near the lighthouse. His hands were badly injured while firing at the creatures. Suddenly a heavy rain began, and the fire was gradually extinguished. After the all-night downpour, by morning David's house had been reduced to nearly ashes. If he wanted to survive, he would have to take refuge in the lighthouse. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse, waiting for the moment Gruner would come to fetch water. When Gruner left the lighthouse to get water, David followed him stealthily. Suddenly, a strange creature near Gruner attacked David, but somehow David managed to subdue it. That creature was Gruner's guardian. As David was about to shoot it, Gruner stopped him and said, "Wait, this is my pet." David did not shoot. Instead, he used the opportunity to make a bargain with Gruner. If Gruner would let him live in the lighthouse, he would keep the creature alive, otherwise David would kill it. Gruner agreed because David had plenty of food and gunpowder. Before evening, they carried the remaining food back to the lighthouse and slept peacefully. The next morning, the creature quietly licked David's hand. When David woke, he found that the creature's licking had miraculously healed his hand. David was astonished. He wanted to learn more from Gruner about the creature and reveal it to the world. It seemed like magic. David thought that if they exposed this secret, both he and Gruner would gain fame and wealth. But Gruner did not want that. He did not want to leave the island. There was nobody left for Gruner in the world. This island was perfect for him. Here he ruled himself like a king. Gruner had even written around the island that he was its ruler. David couldn't understand how this strange creature had become Gruner's servant. Gruner explained that once he had saved its life, the creature had accidentally been caught in his fishing net when it was small. From that day it stayed with Gruner and began obeying him. But Gruner was a cruel man. He mistreated the creature. He kept it with him every day and abused it physically. Gruner even said that the creature had once attacked him, and in retaliation he punished it so severely that it came to see itself as his slave. Now you can understand why the other creatures come out of the sea every night. They come to rescue their companion from Gruner. But Gruner would not allow that. The creatures cannot attack during daylight because sunlight burns their skin. David no longer wanted to stay on the island. He wanted to escape with his life. Evening came and Gruner told him to take the gun and be ready, because the creatures could attack any time. They prepared to turn on the lighthouse light, and soon a great number of creatures surged from the sea toward the lighthouse. Gruner kept firing at them, but David was paralyzed with fear. He retreated into a corner and, despite Gruner's repeated orders, remained motionless. Before long, David fainted. Gruner spent the whole night fighting the creatures alone. In the morning, Gruner splashed water on David's face to wake him and said, "If you want to live, you must kill them. Otherwise you will be kicked out of the lighthouse and must obey my every command. Fetch water daily, do the lighthouse chores, and stand guard with me at night." David had no choice. Survival made it all compulsory. He began to obey Gruner. But one thing he could not accept was Gruner's daily physical torture of the female creature. Night came again, and they prepared for guard duty. This time David was not afraid. He opened fire on the creatures. But Gruner did nothing. He shut the lighthouse gate and sat quietly inside so that David would learn to fight the creatures himself. David fought through the night, and by morning Gruner found him sitting outside the lighthouse gate, covered in blood. David had learned to fight them. Time passed. Nights of combat and days of performing lighthouse duties turned the island into a prison for him. He kept wondering when he would breathe free again. Over time, David developed an odd friendship with a female creature. He felt sorry for her. He now understood how hard loneliness could be. Perhaps the creature felt the same. David named her Anarius. Days went by, and they noticed the creature's attacks lessening. David thought maybe in winter they migrated elsewhere, or perhaps they understood that fighting Gruner and David achieved nothing. But Gruner insisted that was not the case. The creatures would attack again, and they were increasing their numbers. Some days later, after dinner, Gruner and David started playing chess to pass the time. But Gruner made a grave mistake. They became so absorbed in the game that they forgot to switch on the lighthouse light. Taking advantage of the darkness, the creatures attacked. David saw that the number of creatures was so great that two people together could not hold them off, and this time they had no plan. Their bullets were almost finished. Somehow they reached the top of the lighthouse, but Gruner had suffered a deep wound in his leg. The creatures were overwhelming them, and both thought death was certain. Fortunately, morning arrived. As the sun rose, the creatures left the lighthouse and returned to the sea. In the strong daylight, Anarius tried to heal Gruner's wounds. By now David understood they could not win this war against the creatures. Their bullets were nearly exhausted, and they did not have enough food to last. The next day, when David was wandering outside the lighthouse, he saw a ship at sea. He hurriedly fetched a flare gun and signaled the ship, but Gruner stopped him because he did not want David to leave. At that moment Anarius attacked Gruner, trying to protect David. Gruner would never allow anyone to leave this island. It was his world, where he lived like a king. He had someone to talk to now. If David went aboard the ship, he would reveal Anarius and the others to the world. So David could not leave. David watched helplessly as the ship vanished into the sea. Days passed. Gruner continued to mistreat David and Anarius. David disliked especially how Gruner abused Anarius. One day David gave Anarius a small toy boat he had carved from a fishbone. When Anarius saw it, she took David to a part of the island where, to his astonishment, a real boat was hidden. David asked Gruner about the boat. Gruner admitted he had known about it. People had once come to the island by boat to save themselves. But by morning none of them had survived. The creatures had killed them. Those people had been carrying ammunition in their ship, but a storm had sunk their vessel near the island. Hearing this, an idea formed in David's mind. They still had something resembling a diving suit. David suggested that if one of them donned the suit and dove to the wreck, they might recover bullets or dynamite to make the fight against the creatures easier. Gruner refused, but David, risking his life, decided to attempt it anyway. David was ready to do it. A few more days passed, and his bond with Anarius grew stronger. David had begun to fall for her. One day, as the two shared a tender moment, Gruner secretly watched them. Seeing this, Gruner became enraged. He feared that Anarius was slipping away from him and decided that David had to be removed. The next day, Gruner pretended to agree to David's plan. He told David, "All right, you'll wear the diving suit, go underwater, and collect as much RDX as you can. Then I'll pull you back up with a rope." But Gruner had a different intention. He planned to let David bring up the dynamite boxes and then leave him down there to be killed by the creatures. That way, Gruner would get the explosives, and Anarius would once again be his obedient slave. They both took the boat to the spot where the ship had sunk. David put on the diving suit and descended into the deep sea. When he reached the bottom, he saw the shipwreck completely destroyed. Fortunately, he found some boxes of dynamite. But suddenly, a few creatures appeared in front of him. Seeing them, David panicked and fell. The suit was so heavy that he could barely move, and he couldn't signal Gruner for help. Gruner assumed the creatures had killed David. But in reality, they were just two small children of the sea creatures. David somehow managed to free himself from the suit and swim back to the surface. There, he and Gruner found several old boxes containing dynamite. They got to work immediately, setting up 2 layers of dynamite around the lighthouse, so that during the next attack, they could destroy the monsters in one massive blast. Months passed, and winter arrived. Once again, the creatures disappeared. The attacks suddenly stopped, as if they knew a trap had been set for them. Gruner suspected that Anarius had warned them, and in his rage, he began torturing her. But David stopped him. Finally, the two devised a new plan, to leave the main gate of the lighthouse open. When the creatures entered, they would blow them all up with dynamite. Cleverly, David asked Anarius to go to the top of the lighthouse and scream. Hearing her cries, the sea creatures became furious. When they saw the lighthouse gate open, they thought it was their chance to rescue her. But it was actually a trap. Soon, the creatures emerged from the sea and rushed toward the lighthouse. They broke through and attacked David, but he fought back with all his strength and managed to escape. As the creatures reached the lighthouse, Gruner pulled the lever to detonate the dynamite, but nothing happened. The blast failed because David had disconnected the wire earlier, and Gruner had forgotten to reconnect it. David quickly ran upstairs and started fixing the wires while the creatures climbed up the lighthouse walls. Gruner tried to hold them off alone. Once David reconnected the wires, he triggered the first explosion. A massive blast killed many of the creatures instantly. But more of them kept coming, so Gruner detonated the second layer. The explosion was so powerful that both men were knocked unconscious. The next morning, when they regained consciousness, Anarius was gone. Dead creatures were scattered everywhere. Gruner began killing the remaining injured ones. But then David noticed something. One of the dying creatures was wearing a necklace. Seeing it struggling in pain, David felt a deep sense of guilt. He finally understood that these creatures were not monsters. They were living beings, just like humans, only unable to speak. But to Gruner, this realization meant nothing. After that day, the creatures never attacked again. Yet every night, cries could be heard echoing from the sea. David realized the horror of what they had done. How many families had been destroyed, how many children were now orphaned, all because of a misunderstanding. The next day, David saw a few small sea creature children near the shore, survivors who had lost their families. Feeling remorse, David arranged stones in a circle and placed the small toy boat in the middle, hoping Anarius would see it and return. He waited for hours, but she never came. The next morning, when David woke up, he saw Gruner sleeping. Near him were some of his old belongings, including a faded photograph. When David looked closely, he was stunned. It was the same woman whose photo he had found in Robert's diary on his first day. She was standing beside Gruner. That's when David realized the truth. The old weather officer Robert had never died. He had changed his identity. Gruner was Robert. He had simply taken a new name because he never wanted to leave the island again. After that discovery, David lost all hope of ever escaping. The next evening, as he went to the shore, he saw that the small toy boat he had left in the circle was gone. In its place stood a little sea creature child holding the boat. David gently threw a burning stick into the circle, signaling that he meant no harm. He wanted peace. He wanted to show them he wasn't their enemy. Moments later, Anarius emerged from the sea, followed by a group of creatures. But this time, none of them attacked. They only wanted safety, a home for their children. Just then, Gruner appeared with a gun in his hand. He believed that if peace returned, he would lose his sense of power and control. David tried to reason with him, saying the creatures didn't want to fight anymore, they wanted peace. But Gruner refused to listen. He yelled at Anarius, ordering her to go inside. For the first time, she disobeyed him. She was no longer his slave. Seeing this, Gruner felt his reign crumbling. No one was obeying him anymore. Furious and desperate, he stormed toward the lighthouse. David thought maybe Gruner had finally understood that every living being deserves freedom. No one is meant to live as a slave. But Gruner's obsession with being the ruler hadn't left him. As soon as he reached the lighthouse, he fired a flare gun. The flare struck one of the sea creature children and killed it instantly. The terrified creatures fled back into the ocean. Anarius, heartbroken, lost all trust in David. Enraged, David ran to the lighthouse to confront Gruner. He attacked him, shouting, "Why did you do this? They only wanted peace." But Gruner had lost his sanity. He decided to kill David. Grabbing an iron rod, he swung it at him. Before he could strike, David shouted, "Stop, Robert! You're not a killer." Hearing his real name froze Gruner. Because deep down, Robert had never truly been a murderer. After coming to the island, living alone for so long had completely broken his mental health. Loneliness, the death of his wife, and deep depression had changed him into someone else. In truth, he was never a killer. He was once a good man. Gruner finally realized that those creatures never wanted to fight. They only desired peace. He had killed them just to make himself feel powerful. Now, filled with guilt, Gruner understood his mistake. So, he surrendered himself to the creatures, and within moments, they killed him. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time passed slowly, and a year later, a government officer arrived on the island with a new weather officer. Their duty was to take over the weather monitoring station. When the captain asked David about the previous officer, David replied that the man had gone toward the sea and never returned. The new weather officer assumed that David was Gruner himself. David didn't correct him. He stayed silent, walked out to the balcony, and stood there without saying a word, because now he too didn't want to leave the island, just like Gruner. Meanwhile, Anarius was living happily with her family. They no longer feared anyone like Gruner. At last, both on the island and in the sea, they could live freely, in peace. And with that, the story comes to an end.